At 35,000 feet above the Earth, inside the dark belly of a massive bomber, a fighter pilot waited, engine silent, wings folded, suspended like a weapon yet to be unleashed. He was not flying to battle. He was hidden inside it. If war planners were right, this pilot would soon be dropped into the sky itself, released from the stomach of a bomber, igniting his jet engine midair and charging directly at enemy fighters. No runway, no base, no return path except one, to claw his way back into the bomber that carried him. It sounded like science fiction. It was real. And for a brief moment during World War II, the United States believed this tiny, secret jet fighter could change the future of air warfare. This is the story of the XF-85 Goblin, the fighter America built inside a bomber. By 1942, the skies over Europe and the Pacific had become killing fields. American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, and later the massive B-29 Superfortress, were designed to strike deep into enemy territory. They carried bombs capable of destroying factories, rail yards, and cities. But they carried something else too: vulnerability. Bombers were slow. They were large. And they were impossible to hide. Enemy fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, FW-190s, and later Me-262 jets, tore through bomber formations with brutal efficiency. Defensive machine guns helped, but they were never enough. Every long-range mission meant losses, sometimes catastrophic ones. The obvious solution was fighter escort. But there was a problem. Early in the war, American fighters simply could not fly far enough. P-40s, P-39s, and early P-38s lacked the range to escort bombers all the way to their targets. They could protect the bombers for part of the journey, then had to turn back, leaving the bombers alone in enemy skies. German pilots called this moment the free hunt. Bomber crews knew it as the moment death arrived. Desperation breeds creativity. Inside classified rooms at the U.S. Army Air Forces, and later the newly independent U.S. Air Force, engineers and strategists asked a question no one had asked before. What if the fighter didn't have to fly from a base at all? What if it could travel inside the bomber? The idea was radical, but not entirely new. Experiments with parasite fighters had been attempted before, most notably by the British with airships and by the Soviets with composite aircraft. None had worked well. But technology was changing. Jets were coming. And jets, unlike piston fighters, could be made small. If a fighter could be built tiny enough. If it could be stored inside a bomber. If it could be launched and recovered in midair. Then bombers would never be alone again. This idea would have remained fantasy, if not for one aircraft. The Convair B-36 Peacemaker. The B-36 was not just large. It was colossal. With a wingspan longer than a football field and a bomb bay big enough to hold entire aircraft, the B-36 was designed for intercontinental bombing, able to fly from North America to targets anywhere in the world without refueling. It was the first true global bomber. And inside its massive bomb bay, engineers saw something else. Space. Enough space to carry a fighter. In 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces issued a secret request: design a jet-powered parasite fighter capable of being launched and recovered by a bomber in flight. McDonnell Aircraft answered the call. What they proposed looked nothing like a traditional fighter. It was short, stubby, almost toy-like. They called it the XF-85 Goblin. The name was fitting. Like the mythical creature, the Goblin was small, aggressive, and meant to leap unexpectedly into combat. The XF-85 was barely larger than a car. Length just over 14 feet. Wingspan 21 feet with folding wings. Weight, less than 5,000 pounds fully loaded. It carried no landing gear. None. It was never meant to touch the ground. Instead, it would be carried inside the bomber's bomb bay, suspended from a trapeze-like launch system. When enemy fighters appeared, the bomber would open its bay doors, lower the Goblin into the slipstream, release it, and the pilot would ignite the jet engine midair. To return, the Goblin pilot would have to fly directly beneath the bomber, match speed perfectly, and hook onto the trapeze while both aircraft raced through turbulent air at high altitude. Miss the hook, and the Goblin would be lost. So would the pilot. No one was forced to fly the Goblin. The men who volunteered knew exactly what they were signing up for. They would test an aircraft with no landing gear, no base to return to, no margin for error. These pilots were not reckless. They were elite test pilots, men accustomed to flying experimental machines that barely obeyed the laws of aerodynamics. Still, even among them, the Goblin inspired unease. Because this wasn't just a new plane. It was a new idea of war. By the time the first XF-85 prototypes were ready for testing, World War II was over. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had changed everything. But the Goblin project did not stop. If anything, it became more important. The Cold War had begun. And now, bombers carrying nuclear weapons would need protection deeper into enemy territory than ever before. The Goblin was no longer just a wartime experiment. It was a glimpse into a terrifying future. The first time engineers tried to launch the Goblin, no one spoke. Inside the control aircraft, a modified B-29 used as a test platform, crew members watched gauges, cables, and wind readings in tense silence. Below them, the sky stretched endlessly. Above them, history waited. Suspended beneath the bomber was something aviation had never truly seen before. A jet fighter with no landing gear, no runway, and no escape route. The XF-85 Goblin was about to be dropped into the sky. The heart of the entire project was not the Goblin itself. It was the trapeze. Engineers knew that launching a small jet into turbulent air was dangerous, but recovering it would be exponentially worse. At bomber cruising speeds, the air behind the aircraft was chaotic, violent, and unpredictable. Any fighter attempting to approach from below would be fighting invisible forces. The solution was a retractable steel arm mounted inside the bomber's bomb bay. It worked like this. 1. The bomber opened its bomb bay doors. 2. The trapeze lowered the Goblin into the airflow. 3. Once clear, the fighter detached and ignited its jet engine. 4. For recovery, the process reversed. The Goblin had to hook itself back onto the trapeze mid-flight. On paper, it worked. In the air, it was a nightmare. The XF-85's first flights did not begin with launches. Instead, the Goblin was airdropped like a bomb, released from a B-29 to test basic handling and stability. These early tests were meant to answer one simple question. Could the Goblin fly at all? Surprisingly, the answer was yes. Once free of the bomber, the tiny jet proved fast, responsive, and agile. Pilots reported good acceleration and acceptable control, though the aircraft was extremely sensitive. Every movement mattered. There was no room for error. But flying alone was never the goal. The real test was coming. On August 23, 1948, test pilot Ed Scott climbed into the cockpit of the Goblin. He strapped himself into an aircraft smaller than many fighter cockpits alone. Instruments crowded his field of view. There was no second chance, no backup plan. If something went wrong, there was only one way out. Eject. The bomber reached altitude. The bomb bay doors opened. Wind roared through the cavity like an angry ocean. Slowly, mechanically, The trapeze lowered the Goblin into the sky. For a moment the aircraft hung there, half in the bomber's shadow, half in open air. Then it dropped. The jet engine ignited, and the Goblin flew. For several minutes everything worked. The fighter maneuvered near the bomber, proving it could keep pace and respond to commands. Engineers watching from the bomber felt relief for the first time. Then came the recovery attempt. As Scott guided the Goblin toward the bomber, he immediately felt it. Turbulence. Not mild. Not manageable. Violent. The air beneath the bomber churned like boiling water. The Goblin bucked, rolled, and surged unpredictably. Each attempt to line up with the trapeze ended in violent oscillations. The fighter was being tossed around by forces no wind tunnel had fully predicted. Still Scott tried again. And again. Each approach brought the Goblin closer, then threw it away. Fuel levels dropped. Time ran out. Finally, Scott made the only decision he could. He ejected. The Goblin plunged into the desert below and was destroyed on impact. The pilot survived. The program continued. Engineers went back to their drawings. They reinforced the trapeze, adjusted approach angles, modified control surfaces, tweaked flight procedures. They told themselves the problem was not the idea, but the execution. The Goblin flew again. And again. Each test ended the same way. Launch successful. Combat simulation promising. Recovery terrifying. In one flight, Scott managed to hook the trapeze, but only after being slammed violently into the bomber's underside, cracking the canopy and damaging the aircraft. He survived. Barely. Inside the Goblin cockpit, recovery was described as trying to dock with a moving building while riding a leaf in a hurricane. The pilot had to match the bomber's speed perfectly, stay directly beneath it, counteract severe turbulence, align a tiny hook with a small target, all while flying blind into disturbed air. Even minor mistakes could be fatal. And this was during tests, with calm skies, careful planning, and no enemy fire. In real combat conditions, the task bordered on impossible. While America struggled with the Goblin, the world was changing. Jet fighters were no longer experimental. They were operational. Aircraft like the MiG-15 and advanced American fighters promised long range, high speed, and powerful armament, all without needing to hide inside bombers. The original problem the Goblin was meant to solve, escort range, was slowly disappearing. But the project continued, because canceling it meant admitting something terrifying, that the future of warfare had outpaced imagination. By late 1949, the verdict was clear. The XF-85 Goblin was ingenious, courageous, revolutionary, and fundamentally flawed. It could fly, it could fight, but it could not reliably return. A weapon that could not come home was not a weapon, it was a gamble. And in the nuclear age, gambles were unacceptable. By the time the Goblin returned from its last violent test flight, the war it was designed for no longer existed. Not because it had ended, but because it had transformed. The skis of the late 1940s were no longer ruled by propellers and formations. They were being claimed by speed, altitude, and jets that could cross continents without stopping. And in that new sky, the parasite fighter began to look like a relic of a problem already solved. When the Goblin was conceived, escort fighters simply could not follow bombers to their targets. That fact had driven everything. But while engineers struggled to tame turbulence and trapezes, another solution quietly matured: long-range jet fighters. Drop tanks improved. Fuel efficiency increased. Aerial refueling became viable. Aircraft like the Thunderjet and later the F-86 Sabre promised something revolutionary. They could escort bombers the entire way without hiding inside them. The Goblin's original mission evaporated. World War II ended with a flash brighter than the sun. Nuclear weapons changed the purpose of bombers forever. Now, bombers weren't just instruments of destruction, they were symbols of deterrence. Their survival mattered more than ever. Losing a bomber no longer meant losing a crew and a mission. It meant losing strategic leverage. That reality exposed the Goblin's greatest weakness. If a parasite fighter failed to recover, the bomber would have to choose: abort the mission or abandon its own escort pilot. In nuclear war planning, that was unacceptable. Every component had to be predictable. The Goblin was not. Beyond the danger, the Goblin introduced new complications. Each bomber would need specialized launch and recovery equipment, extra maintenance crews, custom training for pilots and bomber crews. One bomber, one fighter, one pilot. The cost was enormous. Meanwhile, conventional fighters could protect multiple bombers at once. Efficiency won. There was another factor, one rarely written in official reports. Fear, not of the enemy, but of the idea itself. Pilots trusted their aircraft. They trusted runways. They trusted formation flying. But trusting a steel hook to catch you at 35,000 feet, inside turbulence, required a different kind of courage. Even among test pilots, enthusiasm faded. This was not fear of flying. It was fear of uncontrollable risk. In 1949, the U.S. Air Force made its decision. The XF-85 Goblin program was canceled. No combat deployment. No production run. No second chance. The surviving prototype was placed in storage, eventually finding a permanent home in a museum. Officially, the project ended quietly. Unofficially, it became a warning. But ideas do not vanish easily. Though the Goblin was shelved, the parasite concept lingered in classified discussions. Engineers revisited it for reconnaissance drones, interceptor concepts, and even space-age launch systems. The lesson was clear. The idea wasn't wrong. The timing was. The Goblin failed not because it was foolish, but because it arrived before technology could support it. Turbulence modeling was primitive. Flight control systems were manual. Automation did not exist. Decades later, drones would launch from aircraft with ease. Autonomous docking would become routine. But in 1949, the Goblin asked too much of human hands. Even in failure, the Goblin proved something profound: that the United States was willing to gamble on ideas no one else dared to try. That air warfare was no longer bound to runways. That the bomber was not just a weapons platform, but a mothership. The future would return to this concept. Just not yet. When the Goblin was rolled into storage, no ceremony marked its passing. No speeches. No headlines. No medals. Just paperwork, quiet orders, and a simple conclusion stamped across classified reports. Program terminated. But history does not end when a project fails. Sometimes that is where it begins. The XF-85 Goblin disappeared from public view, but its data did not. Flight reports, wind studies, recovery attempts, and pilot testimonies were archived, locked away inside filing cabinets and classified libraries. Engineers studying future aircraft quietly referenced them. Because while the Goblin failed operationally, it succeeded intellectually. It answered questions no one else had dared to ask. One idea survived intact: the mothership. If a bomber could carry a fighter, why not reconnaissance craft? Why not experimental weapons? Why not machines without pilots? Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. military explored air launch systems repeatedly. High-altitude reconnaissance drones, experimental spaceplane launch concepts, airdropped missile platforms. Each owed something to the Goblin. The notion that an aircraft could be born in the sky had been proven. The Goblin asked humans to do what machines were not yet capable of. Decades later, machines caught up. Modern drones launch from aircraft with precision unthinkable in 1948. Automated systems manage turbulence, alignment, and recovery, tasks that once nearly killed test pilots. In many ways, the Goblin was the first unmanned aircraft idea forced to be manned. Had it been designed 50 years later, it would never have carried a pilot at all. The parasite fighter concept also echoed beyond the atmosphere. The idea of one vehicle carrying another, launching it mid-flight, recovering it later, became foundational in spaceflight. Carrier aircraft launching spaceplanes, boost vehicles releasing orbital craft, modular spacecraft designs. These were no longer desperate wartime experiments. They were standard engineering practice. The Goblin had been right about the future, just catastrophically early. The men who flew the Goblin never became famous. Their flights were classified, their crashes buried in reports, their courage uncelebrated. Yet they climbed into an aircraft with no landing gear, trusted a hook instead of a runway, and accepted that failure meant death. They were not chasing glory. They were chasing the edge of possibility. Today, the XF-85 Goblin sits in a museum. Visitors often laugh. It looks small, strange, almost cute. Few realize how close it came to reshaping air combat, or how terrifying it was to fly. The Goblin is not a relic of foolishness. It is a monument to ambition without safety nets. The Goblin matters because it reveals something uncomfortable. Innovation is not a straight line. Progress is built on failure, sometimes violent, sometimes forgotten. Every successful aircraft stands on the wreckage of others that dared too much, too soon. The Goblin dared everything. The XF-85 Goblin was designed with a brutal assumption: that the sky itself could replace the ground, that runways were optional, that gravity could be negotiated, that a pilot could be dropped into war and pulled back out again, using nothing but steel, timing, and courage. For a brief moment in history, that assumption seemed reasonable. World War II shattered every boundary aviation had known. Fighters leapt from biplanes to jets in a single decade. Bombers grew from fragile machines into flying fortresses. Pilots became engineers, and engineers became gamblers. The Goblin was born from this chaos. Not from madness, but from necessity. When survival is at stake, even impossible ideas become logical. The Goblin ultimately failed not because of engineering, but because it demanded too much from the human body and mind. No pilot, no matter how skilled, could reliably read chaotic airflow with the naked eye, make micro-corrections at jet speed, dock blindly beneath a massive aircraft. The Goblin exposed the boundary between human reflex and machine precision. That boundary still exists today. History did not reject the Goblin's vision. It postponed it. Modern air warfare now includes air-launched drones, autonomous refueling, midair docking systems, mothership platforms. But humans are no longer placed at the most dangerous point. The Goblin taught designers what not to ask of pilots. The XF-85 was not a fighter. It was a question about how far air power could be pushed, A question about whether speed and altitude could replace numbers. A question about whether war could be engineered into perfection. The answer, it turned out, was no. But the asking changed everything. There are no battle honors on the Goblin's skin. No kill markings. No squadron insignia. Only smooth metal and forgotten ambition. Yet every time an aircraft releases another vehicle into the sky, every time a drone launches from a wing, every time a mission begins without a runway, the Goblin is there. Invisible. Uncredited. Unforgotten. The Goblin never faced an enemy. Never fired its guns in anger. Never protected a bomber formation. But it fought something else. The limits of imagination. And for that, it deserves its place in history. Innovation without restraint can be as dangerous as stagnation. The Goblin reminds us that not every bold idea belongs in the sky, yet every bold idea belongs in history. Because progress is not made by the safe. It is made by those willing to fail publicly, so others may succeed quietly.